Today we're going to start chapter 4 and we're going to talk about functions. So we've actually seen functions, we've used functions, and basically a function is a piece of code that you write once and you keep using it. So it makes us reuse code, okay? Now, what are the functions that we've been using? The print. Print is a function. What's the job of the print function? The job of the print function is for you to give it something as input in parentheses, give it an argument, and then the print function is going to go and print it out to the user. We talked about the int function. What's the purpose of the int function? What does it do? Well, the int function takes a string as input and it converts that string to an int, to a whole number. The float function, the purpose of the float function was to take a string and convert it to a float. The input function, the purpose of the input function was to take a string, display it to the user, wait for the user to enter a value, and then give it back to you. So these are all functions. Someone went ahead and wrote code that tells the console in Mu what to type, what to print when the user, prints something. Someone wrote code that said how to convert that string to an int and what error message to give if that string cannot be converted to an int. So that code that someone wrote one time and put it in a function, we are reusing it. We are using that function over and over. We don't have to worry about what to do if the string cannot be converted to an int. The int function does that for us. So a function is reusable code, code that you write once and you reuse as many times as you want. And it might take arguments as input. So if you want to give it arguments in those parentheses, you give it arguments, and it might return a result. The int function returns something. It returns back an int. The float returns a float. The input returns a string. So it's going to return something for you. How do we call a function? Well, the way we call a function is by using the name of the function. When I wanted to call print, I would say print, and then parentheses, I tell it what to print. So the way we call a function is by the function name. We put parentheses and then the arguments inside those parentheses. Now, there is a special function called the main function, and that function gets called when the program starts. So in programming and other programming languages, you are required to write a main function. Python doesn't require you to write a main function, but it's there and you should write it, and you should also call it. And I'm going to show you that in a little bit. But let's talk about why we want to write functions. So the first reason we want to write functions is that it helps us with code organization. Just like you have an essay, and an essay is broken up into paragraphs, and every paragraph has like a main idea, and you put all the sentences that have to do with that main idea in the paragraph. The same way with a function, you organize your code. So if I'm doing, a program, a big program that's calculating, let's say, the final grade of all the students, well, I might have a function that collects all the grades. I might have another function that does the calculation of, the weighted average. And then I might have another function that calculates the letter grade based on the weighted average. So instead of having code that is 200 lines long, you break it up into functions, and each function maybe is 50 lines long, and each function has a purpose. So the first thing is that functions help us organize the code. The second reason we write functions is to code reuse. If I wrote code that calculates the weighted average for one student, now I can use this function that I wrote one time and call it 24 times if I have 24 students. I don't have to write the 10 lines of code for every single student. You write it one time, you put it in a function, and then every student I call this function for. So code reuse. You don't want to repeat yourself. And the last thing is modularity. If something gets too long or complex, it will be very hard for you to figure out what is wrong with it. And so we don't want code that is really, really long. We want to break up the code into tasks, little tasks. It also helps with working with people. So if you're working on a project with a team, what you do is you assign every team member a task, and every team member writes their own function that does this task. And then you put all the tasks together, you write your own function, you call all the functions together. So now, how do you write a function? Well, you need to use a word def to define the function, and you need to think of a good name for your function. So let's say here I have a function that I want to print a welcome message to my students, or I want the welcome message that's going to be printed at the beginning of the game with the instructions. So I would say def, and then I put the name of my function that I want to define, and then parentheses. Now these parentheses can be empty parentheses, or they can take some arguments. And what we're going to do in this chapter is see all the different variations. And then you put colon, and underneath the colon, you put all what you want the function to do. So let's do this together. I'm going to go to my new, and let's define a function. So here I'm going to say define welcome print. Let's do it. Game instructions, empty parentheses, colon. And you see that when I pressed the colon and pressed enter, it automatically indented, just like we saw with the if statement. And then I can say, for example, welcome to my game, print to play, press P, and give it all the instructions that I want. You win when you collect 10 coins, and whatever you want to do. So here is a function that I wrote so that at the beginning of the game, all the instructions are going to be printed. Now, it could have been someone's job to write this function. They could be working in their own little world, and then they give me their function at the end. Okay, so this is how I write a function. Okay. Now, how do I call a function? Well, remember when we wanted to call functions before, we put the function name. So if I want to call a function, what I'm going to do is put the function name. Now we said that we should write a main function. And so from now on, we want to start writing main functions. So here I'm going to define my main function. And what I want my main function to do is call this function that I wrote. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define main. Main is the first function that you should write in any program. And what I want my main to do is I want it to call game instructions. Now I should come here and I should call main myself. So how is this code going to run? Well, just because you have a definition of a function doesn't mean it's going to get run. So if I just run this code, you will see that nothing happens. Oops, let's run it again. See, nothing happens. Why? Because all I did was I defined functions. I created functions, but I never called them. To call a function, you put the function name. So if I want to call main, I put main as my method name, my function name. And so here, when main is called, it's going to come search for main. It's going to find the definition here. It's going to go and see, what should I do? And it sees, oh, you need to call game instructions. So it's going to go find game instructions, and then it's going to come here and say, okay, what should I do? And it's going to find that it needs to do 3 print statements. So this code, when we run it, prints 3 statements. Okay, so this is how you define a function. You write def, you think of a good name for your function, you put parentheses, and we're later going to learn how to put things in these parentheses. You put colon, and then you put everything that you want in here. You could ask the user for input. So I could say, for example, user choice equal to input. You want to play. And for example, if user choice equal yes. Okay, start. And okay, bye, for example. So your function can be as long as you want it to be. It can ask the user for input. So here, if I say no, it says, okay, bye. If I say yes, it says, okay, start. So your function can be as long as you want it. It can have if statements, while statements. But basically, a function has a job to do. And the job of this one was to print some instructions and maybe start the game. Okay. So this is how you write a function. Now, functions can return something, or might not return something. So if I look at the print function that I'm using here, the print function, we call that a void function. Why is it a void function? Because it has a job to do, and it does it, and that's it. I'm not waiting for it to give me anything back. So when I go and say print this message, I'm expecting that it's going to go print the message for me, but I'm not waiting for it to give me something back. I can't come here and say, you know, message equal, because the print is not going to give me anything back. However, when I call input, I'm expecting input to give me something back. So input is not a void function. It returns a string. So here, the input function, when I call it, I'm waiting for the input function to give me something back. So it's not a void function. So a void function is a function that you call, it's going to do something, but it will not give you anything back. It's not going to return anything back to you. You cannot put an equal sign before it and save it in a variable. But input is not a void function. It is a value returning function. It will return a value. Input returns a string. Int returns an integer. Float returns a float. User choice equal yes is returning a Boolean. Yes or no, true or false. Okay, so if you want to write a function that is a void function, you basically write whatever you want to do, and it's not going to return something. Now, what if I want to write a function that will return something back to me? If I want to write a function that's going to return something back to me, I have to use a keyword called return. And the word return, next to it, we put the value that you want to return to whoever called you. Like we said before, input is a value returning function. It returns a string. So this name variable is going to be a string. Int is a function. It's a value returning function. It returns an int. It's going to return the equivalence of this string 10 as an int. These are value returning functions. If I want to write my own value returning function, I just have to make sure that the function in it has the word return with something next to it. And that is how you return a value. And then when you call it, you can put something, a variable, and equal before it, because it's returning something. So whatever it returns is going to get replaced here. So here, get rate is returning 10.5. So when you call get rate and it goes and returns 10.5, this get rate is now as if it's replaced with 10.5. So this line is going to say rate equal to 10.5. And the nice thing also about the return function is that you can use it just to exit. So if you want to, like, if you're going through code and you want to just exit, you can use the word return, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. Okay, so here I have a check value function. It asks the user for a value and for their age, converts it to an int, and it checks if it's less than 0. That means something is wrong, so it'll just return. So let's see an example of that. So here, for example, I'll say, do you want to play or quit? Okay, so if the user says I want to play, it'll say, okay, let's start, and that's fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do something else. Instead, I'm going to say if user choice will equal quit. So if they say I want to quit, I'm just going to return. That's all I'm going to do. Okay, so here I'm saying if the user says quit, return, don't even go back and don't go down and see what else is happening. Just return, exit. Now, how do I write a function that returns a value? Well, here I say maybe get user choice, or maybe get age. And maybe here I'm going to ask the user for their age, equal int input. How old are you? And then all I want to do is just return the age. Now, how do I call this function if I wanted to? Here, what I would do is I would say, let's say user age equal. And here you can create the same name variable as here. I could also call it age, or you can create a different one. But basically, I want the user age to be whatever this method, this function returns. So I'm going to come here and say call get age. And whatever get age returns to you, I want you to tell me what it is. And then maybe here I'll say print user, you are, and then age, years old. Okay. So now main is going to print the instructions and then is going to call get age to do that and then return the age and then print this. So let's see how it's going to work. And I have a problem. Let's see what the issue is. Line 14, invalid syntax. Oh, I'm missing a parenthesis. One of the things about Python is that if it complains about a line, so here it's complaining about line 14. When I go to line 14, which says return age, I see nothing. There's nothing wrong with it. So when it says invalid syntax on a line and you feel the line is correct, usually the issue is with the line before it. So here the issue is that I closed the input parenthesis, but I forgot to close the int parenthesis. So let's try one more time. Okay, and now I have another issue. Now it says line 19, end of line while scanning string literal. So it finished the line and I forgot to close my string. Let's try one more time. Okay, good. Now it's see what's happening. Main got called. Main called game instructions. It came, it printed the welcome to my game. See that? It printed the to play. It printed you win. And then it's waiting for me to answer this question. Now, if I come here and I say quick, it returns. So that means it finishes this function. So now game instructions is done. The next thing it says is go and call get age. So get age is getting called and it's asking me now, how old are you? And I'm going to say 10. And now it complained about something else. So let's see what the error message is here. So here it's complaining about line 19, that in line 19, user age is not defined. And yes, it's not defined because here my variable is user age. So when you call a function, the function doesn't see, like here I did call get age, yes, but main doesn't see the variables here. And we're going to talk more about that in the next class. But here when I said age, main, inside of main, you don't see any variable age. So I can't use age. I should have used user age, the one that I got returned from get age. Let's try one more time. Okay, so here I said quit. Now it's saying, how old are you? I'm going to say 10. And here it returned 10. So this get age got replaced with the number 10. And now user age is equal to 10. And now when it's printing it, saying user, you are 10 years old. Okay, so here when I'm returning a value, I can save this value to a variable. This value can be an int, a float, a string, a boolean. It can be anything. Now, can I return multiple values from a function? In Python, yes. And this is something that's unique to Python, which makes it really nice. So here I have a circle function that takes the radius as input. And what it wants to do, what I want this function to do to me is return two values. I want it to return what the area is and what the perimeter or circumference is. So the formula for area is pi r squared. So pi times the radius squared. So remember, to do squared, we use two asterisks. So r asterisk asterisk 2 means r squared, the radius squared, times pi. And here I defined a variable pi equal to 3.14. The circumference or perimeter is 2 pi r. So 2 times pi, which is 3.14 times the radius. So now this function had two tasks to do. It had to calculate the area and the circumference. And it wants to return both values to the user. It can do that. You can return two values. Here I'm returning the values that are stored in these two variables. But what you do is you separate them with a comma. And so when I want to call this function circle, it's not returning one variable, it is returning two variables. So before the equal, I need two variables to store the answer instead of one variable. Let's see another example. Let's try writing a function that does two things. Let's say def. We didn't really talk about taking arguments, I know, but let's just do that. Let's calc grade, and let's just have it take three numbers, A, B, and C. So let's say these are 3 exam grades, and what I want to do is calculate the average and say what the percent is and what the letter grade is. So the first thing is I'll say average equal to A plus B plus C, and first I need to add them and then divide by 3. So I'm going to wrap the A plus B plus C inside parentheses divided by 3. So that's the average. Okay, and let's say the letter grade, or let's say it's pass fail. So if average is, let's say, greater than 10, then let's say status false. At the beginning, the status is false, but the average is, if it's greater than 10, then I'm going to say, or let's say passed. False. And if the average is greater than 10, I'm going to say passed equal to true, for example. So now I calculated two things. I calculated the average, and I'm determining whether this person passed or not. And at the end, I want to return both of them. So I'm going to say return average, comma, passed. So those are the two values that I'm returning, the average and whether they passed or not. Now here in main, what I'm going to do, we need to put this before main. So let's move it up here. Moved it up before main so that main can see it. Now, instead of doing all this in main, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call calc average. So I'm going to call calc grade with 12, 8, and 4, for example. And now I want to see what the average is and whether the person passed or not. So here I can use any variables. I can use average again if I wanted to, and passed, or I can use different variables. Okay, passing, let's say passing. So here I'm using one variable that's exactly the same name and one variable that's a different name, and doesn't matter. We're going to talk more about that next class. But here I'm expecting that it's returning two things, and I'm then saving it in two different variables. And maybe I'll say print the average was average, and the person, and then maybe if passing, so if passing is true, print pass, else print so let's test it and see how it works. And let's see where the error message is. So here it's complaining about line 18. Line 18 passed. Oh, I forgot to make it uppercase F. Let's try one more time. Okay, so here it said when I passed these numbers in, it calculated the average, and it found that it was 8, so it's less than 10. So it didn't set passed to true, so it returned to me 8 and false. And so here it printed for me the 8, and then because this is false, it returned failed. Now if I make the numbers a little bigger and run it again, now, oh, true has to be uppercase T. Let's try one more time. Now it tells me this is the average and that they passed. So what I was showing here, the purpose of this is to show you that you can return more than one value from a function. Now, can you return 3? No. This is called a tuple. It's something special in Python that you can return 2 values. If you want to return more than 2 values, you'll have to use some other method, and maybe we'll talk about that in one of the later chapters, like chapter 8, for example. But for now, what I want you to know is that you can write methods that are void methods. They do a job, but they don't return anything. Or you can write a method that returns 1 value, or you can write a method that returns 2 values. Okay? Now, I kind of showed you passing arguments, but we're going to talk about it formally now. So the first two functions that we wrote here didn't take any arguments. So when I say game instructions, it doesn't depend on anything. It's just going to go and print the game instructions. Get age, it's going to interact with the user. So it doesn't take anything as input. So these are functions that don't take any arguments. Now I can write functions that take arguments. They can take 1 argument, 2 arguments, 3 arguments, 10 arguments, as many arguments as you want. So when you want it to take an argument, what you do when you're defining the function is you give the names of the arguments that you want to have this function take. So by putting an X here, I'm saying that the square function is taking 1 argument, and I'm going to refer to that argument as X so that I can use it in my code. So whatever you give me, I'm going to call X. And so here I'm going to say X squared, for example. So here, whatever the user gives me, I'm going to call A, B, and C. Now, does the user, the one that's calling, the code that's calling this calc grade, do they have to name them A, B, and C? No. If you look here, I just passed in numbers. As long as I'm giving the right number of arguments, things are going to work. If I call this code without the 3rd argument, it's not going to work. Why? Because this function is expecting 3 arguments, and I gave it only 2 arguments. So here it says missing 1 required positional argument C. It says I'm expecting a C, but you only gave me 2. Now, they could be variables like this, or what I could have also done was said, for example, grade 3 equal to 34, and then here pass in a variable. So you can have hard-coded like numbers or strings, or you can have variables. So as long as this matches this, the count matches, things will work. Okay, so now it's going to work. Now let's say here it's expecting 3 numbers, and I give it a string. So let's say here I give it hi. It's not going to work because it's going to come and complain that at line 17, I tried here. I tried adding an integer and a string. It can't add hi and 12. It can't do that. So when you're calling a function, you need to make sure that you call it with the right argument count and argument type. Does order matter for the functions? Yes, order matters. Here, because I'm doing the average, it doesn't matter. But imagine if I had a function, for example, let's say called raise power, okay? And it takes A, comma, B, and what it's going to do to me, it's going to return A to the power B. That's what it's going to do. Now, if I call, here I'm just going to print immediately. So whatever raise power returns, I'm going to print it immediately. So I'm not saving it in a variable. So if I say I want you to raise 3 to the power 2, and then I want you to raise 2 to the power 3. Do these give you the same answer? They can't give you the same answer. 3 squared is 9. 2 to the power 3 is 8. So they'll give you different answers. Okay, so you get different answers. So the order of the arguments matters. If this is the first argument, this, whatever is in the first argument here, this 3 is going to get copied into the variable A in RAM. This 2 is going to get copied in the variable B in RAM. And so in raise power, it is waiting for an A and a B. And so when you call raise power with 3, 2, what's going to happen in RAM is that it's going to allocate space for A and put the 3 in it. And then the B is going to get a 2 put in it. Okay, so this is what's happening underneath the hood. These variables, these values are getting copied into RAM space for these variables. Raise power is getting RAM space to store these variables in it. And so when you're calling a function, what we need to remember is that order matters of the arguments, the type matters, and the count matters. All this has to match. If the count is different, it's not going to work. If the types are different, it's not going to work. And you have to make sure that the order is correct. Otherwise, you're going to get a different answer if you mix up the order of the arguments. so here's an example where you're giving it more than one argument. And here, like I'm giving it A and B as two arguments. I create a variable added, which is the sum of A and B, and then I return it. Now, when someone wants to call this function add2, what they do is they put the name of the function, and then they ask themselves, what does add2 take as input? Well, it's taking two integers. So I'm going to give it two integers, and whatever it gives me back, it's returning the sum. So I'm going to save that in a variable. And so this is how you would write a function that takes multiple arguments.